This is Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark MacDonald. What do tic-tac-toe, international politics, and animal grooming behaviors have in common? Much more than you might expect. In this episode, we're going to talk about game theory, a field of economics that lets us analyze social interactions by treating them as multiplayer games, and then using math and science to understand the best strategies to win those games. Learning about game theory has been an eye-opening experience for me because social interactions like business and politics and dating can look like some of the most complicated things in the world. But it turns out that a lot of the broad strokes of social interactions make perfect sense if you think of them as multiplayer games, where players are competing or cooperating to make the best of the situation. Game theory is the study of strategic choice. It's a way to apply math and science to social interactions. Before we look at any examples, let's hit a couple of definitions real quick. First, what's a game? A game is any interaction between people where each participant has something to gain, and each person's payoff is affected by decisions made by others. The game could be tic-tac-toe, politics, or animal grooming behavior. A game has players, which are the children, politicians, or chimpanzees involved. A game has moves, which could be drawing an X or an O on a piece of paper, making a political alliance, or eating bugs off your buddy's fur. And a game has payoffs, which could be winning the game of tic-tac-toe, passing a bill or a treaty, or gaining status in chimp society. Game theory helps you understand the strategies that make it more likely you'll get a high payoff. Most of what I have to say about game theory I learned from a book titled The Art of Strategy by Dixit and Nailbuff. It's a great beginner-friendly book that I recommend reading if you find this kind of thing interesting. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about using math and science to study social interactions. We're going to look mainly at 4 different games and discuss different techniques for analyzing the games and strategies for maximizing your payoff. The games are the cake-cutting game, the ultimatum game, coordination games, and the prisoner's dilemma. This will be the first of 2 episodes about game theory. In the next episode, we'll also discuss the game of chicken. But for now, let's move on to Game 1, the cake-cutting game. Our first game is one you may have played before. Here's the situation. There's only one piece of cake left, and you have to split it with your brother. To make things fair, one person cuts and the other person chooses. If you're a 3-year-old, then you might reason like this. If I cut it so one piece is really big, maybe I'll get to eat the big piece. But anyone with even a little bit of experience will realize that if you do that, the other person will pick the big piece and you'll be left with the tiny sad little slice. If you want the most cake you can get, you have to look ahead and reason about what the other person will do. This is our first principle of game theory. Look forward and reason backward. Figure out the other player's future responses and use them to calculate your own best move. If this sounds really easy, congratulations, you can outsmart a 3-year-old. But 3-year-olds are still savvy gamers. If they see they've been cheated, they'll start to cry, and then you'll lose the respect of your family and friends. So that's the second key insight from game theory. If you don't like the game you're playing, look for the bigger game. In this case, winning the cake-cutting game by getting more cake means you lose the respect of your family and friends, and possibly yourself. So you have to ask yourself, which do I care about more, cake or self-respect? So now we have 2 principles for analyzing games, looking forward to reason backward, and considering the bigger game you're part of. These principles will come up again in the next game, but first I need to talk about the setup of the cake-cutting game a little bit more. The cake-cutting game is an example of a sequential game, where one player acts first and the other second. It's also a game where the person who goes second has the advantage. If the first person makes a mistake and cuts the cake unevenly, then the second person is the one who ends up with the bigger piece. The second mover advantage is actually fairly common in sequential games. For example, in rock, paper, scissors, if your opponent went first and you went second, you would always win. That's why rock, paper, scissors isn't typically a sequential game. The rules have you both shoot simultaneously. There are also many sequential games with a first mover advantage, like chess and tic-tac-toe and Scrabble. Sometimes the first mover will have the advantage because they have more options for what to do. Sometimes the second mover will have the advantage because they have more information about what the other person is doing. It really just depends on the game. So, that was the cake cutting game, where one person cuts the cake and the other person chooses. We used it to represent two strategies: look forward to reason backward, and always look for the bigger game. We also talked about the difference between sequential and simultaneous games. Now let's move on to our next game. Game 2, the ultimatum game. Game theorists tend to assume that other people are perfectly rational, which is not always true. Consider the ultimatum game. One person is given $10, and they can choose to give a portion of that to a second person. Then the second person has the option to either accept the split or veto it so that neither person gets any money. A perfectly rational person would never choose to veto as long as they're given any positive amount of money, even just 1 cent. But when scientists perform this experiment, people veto it all the time if they're given too little. Why does this happen? Are people just inherently irrational? Well, yes, but actually no. The traditional answer is that they veto it out of a sense of fairness. People are willing to sacrifice a lot to punish behavior they see as unfair. This is an example of the principle we saw earlier. Always look at the bigger game. I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute, but first, more classification. In game theory, games can be divided into one-shot games and repeated games. A one-shot game only happens one time, while a repeated game is played more than once. It makes sense that if the ultimatum game is played multiple times, then using your veto to tell the other player you only accept fair offers will train them to only give fair offers and earn you more money in the long run. But even if the ultimatum game is only played once, it's played in the context of a bigger game called life, where it's important to never let other people cheat you at anything. We have social norms against unfairness, and if you let someone violate them in a one-shot ultimatum game, then maybe they'll violate them again in a context that's more important to you. I think that a big reason for our sense of fairness is that life is full of repeated games, and punishing others when they do things that are unfair, even when punishing them costs us something, can actually help us in the long run. So what appears as human irrationality can actually make sense as part of the bigger game. I want to give another example of fairness in biology, specifically in chimp grooming behavior. Chimps have a hard time reaching the bugs and tangled fur and whatnot on their backs, so they have others do it, and they expect the others to reciprocate. Also, it's been observed that chimps spend way more time grooming each other than they need to for just their health and comfort. Why? Because grooming behavior isn't actually about getting clean. It's about building social relationships. Chimps who groom each other tend to become allies and share food and help each other in conflicts with other chimps. If a chimp reciprocates on grooming, it's a credible signal that they'll also reciprocate on other, more important activities like feeding and fighting. This example shows that when players interact in several dimensions, like grooming and feeding and fighting, then cooperation in one activity can spill over to other unrelated activities. So, both the ultimatum game and chimp grooming behaviors show that cheating can sometimes gain you a short-term advantage, but it can create a long-term cost. Having a reputation as a cheater will harm you in all your interactions with other people. Having a reputation for keeping your word will help you in all your interactions, so it's important to always consider the bigger game you're part of. Okay, let's move on to game number 3. Game 3, coordination games. Now that we have a basis for how to analyze different games, let's look at a class of games with important real-world applications: coordination games. These are simultaneous games where everyone is better off if they choose the same strategy. Here's an example. You have become the proud owner of a brand new country. It's opening day and you cut the ribbon to let everyone drive away and start doing new country things. Except, oh no, you suddenly realize you forgot to make any traffic laws. People now have a choice. They can drive on the left-hand side of the road or on the right-hand side. It doesn't matter which one you choose because both are equally valid. but it matters a lot that the guy coming the other way made the same choice as you. If you both chose the right or both chose the left, you'll be fine. But if one of you chose to drive on the right and the other on the left, you're going to crash. Let's use this example to look forward and reason backward. You have two strategies to choose between, drive on the left or on the right. The other person has the same two strategies, and you both make your choice at the same time. Looking forward, if the other person chooses to drive on the left, then you get a bigger payoff from driving on the left. The payoff is not crashing. If the other person chooses to drive on the right, you get a bigger payoff from driving on the right. If there are more than two players, then everyone is better off if you can all coordinate and choose either left or right. This example illustrates a concept called Nash equilibrium. A Nash equilibrium is a situation where, given the strategies of all the other players, no one can benefit by changing their own strategy unilaterally. In other words, each player's strategy is the best response to the strategies the others have chosen. In the driving example, if everyone chooses to drive on the right, then no one benefits from switching to the left, and vice versa. Both driving on the left and driving on the right are Nash equilibria, because once a coordination is established, no one is going to want to drive on the wrong side. This was one of the insights of mathematician John Nash, one of the first game theorists, and the subject of the movie A Beautiful Mind. He demonstrated that all finite games have at least one equilibrium where players' strategies are in balance, and no single player can improve their situation by changing their own strategy. We'll look at the idea of Nash equilibrium again in the next game, but for now, let's move on to a couple more examples of coordination problems. First, the metric system. Every engineering student knows that it's easier to calculate things using meters than feet. With meters, the units just work out nicely, and having two different sets of units can cause problems. In 1999, a Mars orbiter crashed into the planet because the designers failed to do a unit conversion. So it's important that everyone coordinates on which sets of units to use, or else people get confused and you sometimes crash spaceships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Here's another piece of data for you. The US is one of only 3 countries to use imperial units, meaning feet and kilograms, as their official units of measurement. The others are Liberia and Myanmar. How did this happen? How did this entire country end up with an inferior set of units? The answer is pirates. The year was 1793. The United States was just a baby country struggling to figure out how to behave, and Thomas Jefferson was given the task of standardizing the system of measurements used in the United States. He wrote to France and asked them to send a guy over to tell them about their shiny new metric system that they had adopted during the French Revolution. The French sent a scientist named John Joseph Dombey to do just that. But while crossing the Atlantic, Joseph Dombey's ship was blown off course by a giant storm, and he ended up in the Caribbean. There he was captured by pirates and held for ransom, but he ended up dying in captivity. If he had made it to his destination, would he have convinced the new country to go metric? Who knows, but I really want to blame all my unit conversion angst in college on pirates. Anyway, the point of the story is that coordination games can have an inferior equilibrium that's determined by historical reasons. And once the equilibrium sets in, we get locked into it. If you personally dislike feet, it doesn't make sense to unilaterally switch to using meters in your daily life if no one around you has a good grasp of how long a meter is. It only makes sense to switch to meters if everyone switches at the same time. Now that everyone in the US uses feet and pounds, it would be really hard and expensive to switch to meters and kilograms, so it's best to make sure not to get locked into a bad equilibrium in the first place. There are also plenty of other inadequate equilibria in industry, government, traffic flow, healthcare, and many other areas of life. And these types of problems can't be solved just by pointing out that there's a better option out there. In a coordination game, someone who switches on their own will be worse off, and it's only if you can manage to get everyone to switch at once that will make things better. But coordinating people to make a change all at once is really hard, especially when you have years of tradition behind the way things are. and so I have great respect for the huge coordination efforts in history, such as the eradication of smallpox, which required many different countries to cooperate and yet somehow managed to succeed. I want to discuss one last coordination problem. This one I encountered as a meme on Reddit. You, and everyone around you, must choose between taking a red pill and a blue pill. If more than 50% of people take the blue pill, everyone lives. If not, then people who took the red pill live, and people who took the blue pill die. It seems like an easy choice, right? Everybody just takes the blue pill and no one will die. But it's also true that if everybody takes the red pill, then no one would die. In fact, you could reframe the scenario as, if you pick the blue pill, then you'll die, unless over 50% of people pick it too, while if you pick the red pill, then you live no matter what. So what do? Different people have wildly different answers that they feel very strongly about. I'll let you decide on your own. Feel free to press pause if you want to think about it more, because I'm moving on. Game 4, The Prisoner's Dilemma. Okay, now we're going to discuss what's probably the most famous game in game theory, the prisoner's dilemma. But before we go over it, I want to remind you about some of the things we've already talked about. We talked about 2 strategies for analyzing games: look forward and reason backward, and always consider the bigger game. We've also introduced the concept of Nash equilibrium, where no one can gain by unilaterally changing their strategy. We'll need all of these principles to understand the prisoner's dilemma. So with that, let's go. Say you have 2 prisoners, Alice and Bob, who are both on kitchen duty. The warden decides to play a game with them. He gives them 2 options, cooperate and defect. If both prisoners cooperate, then they only have to do dishes for 1 day, and they have the rest of the week off. If they both defect, then they have to do dishes for the rest of the week. But if one cooperates and the other defects, then the defector will go off free, no chores at all, and the other person will be stuck doing dishes alone for the rest of the month. What would you do? Let's look at the choice through the lens of game theory, looking forward and reasoning backward. Looking forward, there are 2 situations you want to consider. First, the other person cooperates, and second, the other person defects. If the other person cooperates, then you could cooperate and have to do the dishes, or defect and be free of chores. You prefer to be free of chores, so you should defect. Never mind that it'll force the other person to do dishes for a month. You're a hardened criminal and free of empathy. Now, consider if the other person defects. Then you can cooperate and do dishes alone for a month, or you can defect and only do dishes for a week. You much prefer to defect. So, that's settled. Defecting is your dominant strategy. No matter what the other person does, you would prefer to defect. Case closed. That was a very easy application of game theory. Except, both prisoners would prefer to only do dishes for a day instead of for a week. They much prefer the cooperate outcome to the defect one. Except, defect is a Nash equilibrium, while cooperate is not. Say they manage to coordinate and both commit to cooperation. Then, if the warden takes them aside individually and asks if they want to switch, each of them would benefit from saying yes and defecting. So it's a situation where if each person acts rationally in their own self-interest, then it would produce an outcome that clearly isn't what's best for the group as a whole. The only way to ensure they both cooperate is to somehow change the game. Let's look at how the game can be changed in a way that lets the prisoners cooperate. First and foremost, this might be obvious or maybe not. One way to resolve the problem is if you add in empathy. If the prisoners aren't totally self-interested but also care about each other, then they wouldn't really like the idea of making the other guy do dishes for a whole month. They might genuinely prefer mutual cooperation over a one-sided betrayal. If this is true, then they're not actually facing a prisoner's dilemma. The prisoner's dilemma says that each player has a genuine preference to defect when the other person cooperates. So empathy changes the game and makes it a type of coordination game, which is much more solvable. Second, They might cooperate over a fear of punishment. If you betray the other guy and make them do dishes for a whole month while you go off free of chores, then they might beat you up when nobody's looking. Or maybe they have tall friends who would take it out on you for them. This is how the mafia tends to keep its members from ratting on each other. If they tattle, they might serve a lighter prison sentence, but they won't live long after they get out. The fear of reprisal can be a big motivator to cooperate on a prisoner's dilemma type problem. In that case, winning the prisoner's dilemma means losing the larger game. Third, they may want to cooperate if they know the situation will come up again. There's an important difference between one-shot games and iterated games. If you betray other people, then they definitely won't trust you to cooperate in the future, so it's another example of losing the larger game. There are probably other ways to change the game to allow self-interested parties to cooperate, but these three are enough for now. So, now that we've explored the prisoner's dilemma a little bit, let's look at 100 examples of it in the real world. These real-life situations all share many similarities with a many-player repeated prisoner's dilemma. These situations are the tragedy of the commons, the free rider problem, the race to the bottom, cancer, climate change, and existential risk reduction. First, the tragedy of the commons. I learned about this one in high school with an online game called The Tragedy of the Bunnies. You're a bunny merchant, and you're competing with others to sell the most bunnies. You click on a bunny in the shared pen to sell it. Since the bunnies are shared, you have to click on them as quickly as possible before the other guys take them. But what this means is that all the bunnies get sold, and there are none left to reproduce and make more bunnies for round 2. Everyone collectively would be better off if you could coordinate and not use up all the bunnies, but everyone's individual incentives make them want to click on as many bunnies as possible, as quickly as possible. In real life, this situation is one of the big causes of overfishing. When there's a common fishing area and no regulation, each fisherman has an incentive to fish as many fish as he can fish. It's a prisoner's dilemma. If the area gets overfished, then all the fishermen lose out in the long term. But if they try to coordinate to preserve fish, anyone who fishes more than their fair share ends up making more money and gets rewarded for it. That's why, in situations like this, it's important to have either strong government regulation or privately owned resources. Second, the free rider problem. This is when you throw a potluck and some of your friends bring food to share, but others don't bring anything and just get a free meal. Sometimes there are so many free riders that there isn't enough food for everyone, and it makes the whole potluck a disappointment. Luckily, on a small scale, social norms often prevent there from being too many free riders at your potluck, and if you have a friend that continually mooches to the point that it causes problems, you can just stop inviting them. But at a country or global level, it's a lot harder to uninvite the moochers. Another example of the free rider problem is when you have that one roommate who never does his dishes. Collectively, your apartment is better off if the dishes get done, but each individual has an incentive to wait until somebody else washes the dishes, so they don't have to spend the time and energy on it. If everyone was completely rational when playing the dishes game, then they would always choose to defect, and the dishes would never get done. But some combination of social norms, agreements, threats, and other negotiating tactics has, in my experience, made it so the dishes get done eventually. Third, the race to the bottom. A race to the bottom is when companies compete to lower their prices below their competitors, but their competitors are doing the same thing, so the price drops and reduces the profits of all the companies. If only the companies could coordinate and ensure the prices could remain high. But that's called price fixing, and it's illegal in the US and most other developed countries. We want the prices to race to the bottom, because that's what's best for the consumers. It's a happy accident that the fact that corporations face a prisoner's dilemma on how to set their prices makes the price of goods low for consumers. There's justice in the world after all. Except, the race to the bottom doesn't only affect the price they sell goods at. It can also be a race of quality or safety or workers' rights. If they can get away with lower quality or safety or ethics standards, then their costs will go down, and they'll be able to bring the prices down even more and outcompete their competitors. And if their competitors refuse to cut their own quality or safety or ethics standards, then they'll eventually go out of business. Everyone would be better off collectively if they could all agree to not drop their standards, but without some kind of regulation and enforcement mechanism, either from the government or from a union or from consumer outcry, every company is incentivized to cut their standards before their competitors beat them to it. And that's why it's so hard to solve workers' rights problems, not because the people on top are evil, but because they're trapped in a race to the bottom and don't want to go out of business. Though some of them might be evil too, that's still a possibility. Fourth, cancer. Cells really want to replicate themselves. However, the cells in your body have to work together for your organs to function and keep your body alive. If one cell replicates more than it's supposed to, then it can make your organs fail and then all the cells die. This is a cancer cell. It's a freeloader. It benefits off what all the other cells are doing to keep the body alive, but it doesn't contribute anything. Your body has a bunch of systems in place to try to detect the cells that defect on this prisoner's dilemma and destroy them, but sometimes one of them sneaks through. The cancer cells think they're so smart, but they don't actually understand game theory at all, because their short-term gain will always make them lose the bigger game in the end. Fifth, climate change. Climate change is a prisoner's dilemma. We would be better off collectively if we all stopped emitting greenhouse gases. We even have international climate agreements. But any individual country that cheats on their climate agreements will have an economic advantage. They benefit from the global warming reduction efforts of others without having to pay the costs. They become a freeloader. And a related example, existential risk reduction. Things like preventing humanity from being wiped out by an asteroid impact or a global pandemic. Just like climate change, existential risk reduction is an example of a global public good. Which, yes, it's obvious that reducing the risk of human extinction is good for the global public, but global public good is actually an economics term. A public good is a product or service that everyone benefits from. Everyone profits from it, but the costs fall on whoever performs the service or makes the good. So public goods such as roads and police and public parks are often met by the government, which allows the cost to be spread out over everyone who pays taxes. But a global public good is global. The benefits are spread out over everyone on Earth, and since we don't really have a good international government, these types of goods often get neglected. The number of people working on protecting the world from a future global pandemic or asteroid impact or nuclear war or any of the other things that might end humanity is way, way smaller than it should be. That's because it's a prisoner's dilemma type situation. Everyone is collectively better off if all the countries devote resources towards these types of global public goods. But there are currently very few international agreements about global pandemic prevention or any of the other potential risks to humanity's survival. So what ends up happening is that everyone becomes a free rider and no one actually ends up working on the problem. Except for a few individuals who are intrinsically motivated to preventing human extinction, we salute you and desperately hope you succeed. Everyone benefits from the work of these few brave souls, who bear all of the cost by themselves. And maybe with enough public awareness and political pressure, we can eventually get the governments of countries around the world to step in too. Okay, that's enough examples of prisoner's dilemma-like problems. I'm going to end with a closing thought, one that made me have a real aha moment, one of the key insights I had while writing this episode. It's that the prisoner's dilemma is not a coordination game. In a coordination game, everyone does better if you cooperate, and no one has an incentive to defect. In a prisoner's dilemma, if everyone else cooperates and you defect, you still get the benefits but don't have to pay the costs. Coordination problems are like switching the entire country from using feet to meters. It would be hard to accomplish, but once accomplished, it'll stick. Everyone benefits from being in the majority. Prisoner's dilemma type problems are when different groups need to cooperate to create a good outcome, but each individual has an incentive to cheat and reap the benefits of collective action without paying the costs. This is why it's so hard to solve things like climate change. However, if you can create social norms and appropriate consequences for those who defect, and enforce those consequences, then you can turn a prisoner's dilemma type problem into a coordination problem, which is still difficult but solvable. Okay, that's it for today. In summary, we talked about two principles for solving games. First, looking forward and reasoning backward, which means to predict the moves other players will make and work backwards from there to choose a move that will give you the best outcome. Second, always consider the bigger game you're part of. Sometimes the best move is to let someone else win to preserve your reputation as a team player. We also analyzed games in several different ways. A game can be sequential or simultaneous, and it can be one-shot or repeated. We talked about Nash equilibrium, where no player can benefit by changing their own strategy unilaterally, and how sometimes history can make us get locked into a bad equilibrium, which is why Americans don't use the metric system. We talked about the prisoner's dilemma, and how defecting is a dominant strategy, meaning it's your best move regardless of what the other person chooses. And we talked about some ways to turn a prisoner's dilemma into a different game where cooperation is rational, by implementing social norms, agreements, and rewards or consequences for cooperating or defecting. Finally, we talked about a bunch of different real-life examples of prisoner's dilemma-like problems, including the free rider problem, the race to the bottom, and climate change. Game theory helps us understand why these situations happen and what to do about them. I'm going to end with a joke. Sorry, this joke is a little longer than I usually tell here. Here it goes. A boy walks into a barber shop, and the barber whispers to his customer, "This is the dumbest kid in the world. Watch while I prove it to you." The barber puts a dollar bill in one hand and 2 quarters in the other, and then calls the boy over and asks, "Which do you want?" The boy takes the quarters and leaves. "What did I tell you?" says the barber. "That kid never learns." Later, the customer leaves the barber shop and sees the same young boy coming out of the ice cream store. "Excuse me, may I ask you a question? Why did you take the quarters instead of the dollar bill?" The boy licked his ice cream cone and replied, "Because the day I take the dollar, the game is over." That kid knew how to look for the bigger game. Well, that's the end. Next time I'm going to do Game Theory Part 2, including the game of chicken, and the importance of information and signaling. Thanks for watching. Come back next time for more science. Peace. This has been Ideas Worth Exploring by Mark McDonald.